Sometimes in this job, you just end up falling in love with the country where you work.
Kenya is a very, very special place, and I think is a country that is on an extraordinary upwards curve, a very rapid one. You meet incredibly inspiring people here, and I love it to bits, and it also has a very special place in my heart from a personal direction. I met my wife here, so there are so many reasons why I love Kenya.
My colleague, Stephen Jackson, is the UN resident coordinator in Kenya, and his enthusiasm for the places he's been posted in Africa is infectious. I'm so inspired by his hopes for a very dynamic future there. From the United Nations, I'm Melissa Fleming. This is Awake at Night. Stephen, you've worked in international humanitarian affairs for almost 30 years, but you seem to keep coming back to sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Is there something about the places, the people?
Oh, absolutely. I think you fall in love with Africa, and you fall in love hard. So I've always loved it. In fact, full disclosure, I was even here as a tiny child because my parents worked here in Africa in the 1960s. But I also think beyond the love affair, there's the fascination of it, because this is a part of the world that, despite the cliches, despite the stereotypes that many, I think, would have in the global north, this is a continent that is going places super fast, and it is a very exciting thing, and it's a real privilege actually to be a small part of that journey. When I think we'd have to say in many other parts of the planet, you see disillusion setting in, you see a sense of bewilderment at the future, you see a sense of loss of direction, if you might put it that way, in some of the societies that you and I both know, Melissa. This is a continent that knows where it wants to go. It may not entirely know yet how it's going to get there, but I find that self-confidence and that ambition really invigorating to be a part of. And as I say, it's a bit of a privilege.
Well, this is an interesting start to our conversation, because I think many people, who haven't been to Africa, who just learn about Africa through news coverage, they either hear about wars or huge hunger events or drought. So it'll be really interesting to delve into why you think Africa is the place that is taking off the most in our world. Maybe just really quickly, I mean, what would you say to that person who only gets that kind of news?
I'd say you're only getting less than half the story. It's certainly the case that Africa continues to have wars, and there are some in the neighborhood here, not too far away from Kenya, and they're bad ones. But goodness, Europe is having its wars as well and has had them. And in the meantime, there are far more parts of Africa that are growing super fast, that are innovating, that are exerting positive, constructive forms of soft power in the world, that are inserting themselves in meaningful ways at the global level in terms of really important debates of our time around the climate emergency, for example, that are striking innovations around the green transition, around the just energy transition. And I think none of that story, or very little of that story so far, is making it to the news back home in Ireland, for example, where I come from.
I mean, now you're in Kenya. You also worked in Gabon and Burundi. Is there a particular place that you love, especially where you've served?
Oh, that's such an awkward question to ask a resident coordinator, because it's our job to say it's the country where I serve, Kenya. Kenya is a very, very special place, and I think is a country that is on an extraordinary upwards curve, a very rapid one. And it's one of the fastest growing economies on the continent. It is one of the hubs of innovation. You meet incredibly inspiring people here, and I love it to bits. And it also has a very special place in my heart from a personal direction. I met my wife here, even though neither she nor I are Kenyans. We were both working here in the 90s. So there are so many reasons why I love Kenya. I do have to admit that there is also a massive place in my heart for two other countries that I've lived and worked in. I've loved every part of the continent I've worked in, but particular fondness for both the DR Congo and for Burundi in different ways that are very, very special places. Much more challenged in some ways than Kenya, but also with extraordinary people, with extraordinary degrees of resilience and courage and exciting ideas about the future. So, I fell in love hard with Africa 30 years ago, and I've never really lost it.
Not many people would express such positive feelings for a troubled country like Democratic Republic of Congo. I mean, what was it? What was going on there when you were serving, and what, if you could just describe, what it looked like and what it felt like to be there and some of the challenges it was going through?
Well, absolutely. Let's start with that the Congolese people, and this, I think, one should never totalize in the way that I'm about to, about an entire continent, a continent that's, on its way to 1 billion people, that is full of 54 highly different countries and great diversity. But nonetheless, let me generalize and say...
And even DRC, which is massive.
A continent in itself.
Europe.
Absolutely. 90 million people and, 2,000 kilometers across. But it's not just the resilience of people like the Congolese in the face of the huge challenges that they've had to live through. It's actually, and this risks being a cliche, it's the joie de vivre. It's the fact that the Congolese can still laugh and enjoy life and appreciate life in a way that sometimes I feel in the global north we're in danger of losing. I know that can sound like a terrible stereotype of people, smiling through the tears or laughing through the pain. But let me give you a story, if I could, Melissa, from well before I joined the UN, back in the 90s, during the height of the war, and I was researching for my PhD in anthropology, which was about this dimension, I think, of Congolese resilience. And I had a great friend who was working with one of the local NGOs, and he was a Muslim. About 10% or so of the population overall, I think, is Muslim. And he said to me one day, he said, "Stephen, you're Christian, right?" And I demurred a little bit and said, "Well, I, raised in a Christian country. Let's leave it at that." And he said, "Never mind. But your Bible, they have these horsemen of the apocalypse, right? How many of them have you got?" Because he said, "I just want to check. I think you've sent us all 4. You're not hiding any, are you?" And he was talking, this was Goma. He said, "We've had war. We've certainly had pestilence. We've had famine and plague." And he said, and now, this was 2002, the volcano had just erupted and engulfed much of central Goma. He said, "So now we've had fire. That's the 4, right? There aren't any more, are there?" And he was giggling as he said it. And I've just never forgotten it. The sort of the gallows humor of it, the sense of fun, because what else can keep you alive than a sense of humor and that kind of resilience in the face of the kinds of setbacks and disasters that would probably have killed you or me.
I'm just curious how you responded.
I said, "No, don't worry, those are the 4." Yeah, but and I mean, I could go on. There are endless stories of, the Congolese love affair with words, incredible wordsmiths, street poets, punsters, And if you're Irish, you love puns, right? So almost every day, somebody would say something howlingly funny in a context of absolute misery, well, maybe there's something a bit in common, therefore, between the Irish and our love of gallows humour and that.
Ireland has had its share of misery
Down the years. Doing better
down the
now, but down
years.
the years for sure.
Doing much better now. I'm wondering if, I mean, you mentioned also Burundi.
Well, Burundi, for people who don't know it, is a small country in terms of territory, but very big in terms of populations. It's one of the most densely populated countries in the world. It lies just to the south of Rwanda, with which it shares many of the same characteristics, traditionally a very strong polity prior to colonialism, and then that polity or that political structure a bit more than a bit hijacked by the colonial power, more than a bit distorted by the colonial power, and those distortions ripple on into the independence period. And so Burundi, like Rwanda, afflicted by waves of interethnic violence, very, very destructively. When I first went to Burundi in 1992, I think a lot of people coming again from North America or from Western Europe would come in and go, my God, this is very unfamiliar territory, this degree of mistrust, this degree of violence, this degree, in some cases, of hatred between ethnic groups, quote unquote, tribes, and find it very difficult to fathom. Sadly, if you come from Ireland, it's not that difficult to understand. It's a very, very similar dynamic to the one that still afflicts the northern part of our country, Northern Ireland. In Northern Ireland, the organizing logic of hatred is religion. In a Burundi or a Rwanda, it's ethnic identity. But actually, at the end of the day, the dynamics are very, very similar. So it wasn't that I liked that when I first arrived in Burundi, and then a year later, indeed, in Rwanda in 93 and then in 94. But I'm afraid it was intimately familiar. And the way in which that logic of us and them works, outsiders finding it very difficult to know how these differences become so inflamed when, to an outsider, everybody looks like they belong to one common pool of people. And so how different cues give the game away. Is it your name? Is it your accent? Is it the part of the country that you're from? Is it the school that you went to? Those are all cues, by the way, in Northern Ireland, or indeed in Ireland as a whole. That's how you work out as whether somebody's Catholic or Protestant. And I'm afraid you grow up doing that in Ireland. Automatically. It's not that you're taught to do it, you're taught to do it by the situation in a way that is subconscious and automatic and very pernicious. Well, works the same way in a Burundi or a Rwanda. So that's what I mean by the similarity of the dynamic.
I mean, just pick up on something that you said there. I mean, that dynamic led to a genocide in Rwanda. If those signals had been seen, do you think it could have been prevented? And what was the dynamic that tipped it over the edge? Was it media? Was it propaganda? Was it just not much talked about?
I think the question of where the origin of that comes from is a very hard one. So let's put that aside. I think that's controversial, and it's where does anything ever begin? Cain and Abel. The first murder that leads to the second, that leads to the thousandth, that leads to the millionth. But your question about what tips it over the edge, well, I certainly think that economics plays a part. I think deprivation, and I think we actually know from research globally, not just in Africa, not just in Europe, but globally, we know that the most dangerous thing is when internal inequality in a country, is perceived, whether rightly or wrongly, to map onto identitarian differences of different kinds. That's what the research shows.
I mean, do you think now that we're in the social media era, do you think that we're in a more dangerous place for when we have those kinds of situations of inequality and othering that you just described?
That's a really interesting question. I'm tempted, oddly enough, to say no. I don't think it's necessarily more dangerous. And the reason why, I think it's that classic point, isn't it, that any new technology can work for both good and for ill. So just as social media, the internet, the rapidity of all of that allows, a kind of a vortex of disinformation, a vortex of hate to propagate very rapidly. But it does also, if we seize the opportunity, it does give us a set of tools with which we can also combat that kind of vortex very quickly as well, and with a kind of reach that we couldn't have had before. I think there's enormous potential there. So I don't know. Then it's an arms race, isn't it? Which one's going to win?
It is an arms race, yes, and I that leads me to come back to Kenya, because I remember having a conversation with you before the election, the August 2022 election. I believe you said it was a model for other African countries. Why?
Because we had a knife edge close election in a country that has had its brushes with difficult elections in the past and quite large-scale electoral violence in the past. And yet, you had one of the cleanest, one of the most orderly, one of the most transparent elections ever in Kenya. Some issues at the margins, but where aren't there anywhere in the world? No election is ever perfect. You had a knife-edge result, a difference of about 200,000 votes, there or thereabouts. And yet the country remained peaceful, and the challenge that was brought by the opposition was definitively settled by and at the Supreme Court. So every institution did its job. That's really the point that I'm trying to make. Now, I'm making it sound, smooth. Like I said, no election is ever smooth, and there were moments. But for me, and I think for many international partners like us that were up close and personal to that, it was an extraordinary thing, and it really did provide a very inspirational model. And by the way, we've seen very powerful countries have knife-edge elections and have very, very significant difficulties, including violence. So I think Kenya deserves a lot of credit for it. The 2010 Constitution really lays out that institutional map in a way that I think is very visionary, to take proactive steps to maintain peace, to sustain peace, to maintain national cohesion, to have fail-safe mechanisms, to have grievance resolution mechanisms, to have ways of ensuring that difference and dissent don't turn into violence. And I think that's the genius of Kenya's constitution. I don't know too many countries around the world that have this, what we call a national peace infrastructure. If I can make a strange analogy, it's a public health model. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. So that's why we put fluoride in the water. It's why we get vaccination. It's why we take all of these precautions to keep a healthy population. Well, it's like that. It's taking all of these precautions to maintain a society that is cohesive, that can handle difference and dispute in non-violent ways. Does it always work? No. We've had actually street protests in the last 48 hours here in Kenya that very sadly turned violent, and there was loss of life. And that is very much to be regretted. But like I said, that also happens in other parts of the world. That has happened in my part of the world.
It's an interesting concept of a public health model for peace and cohesion and prevention. I just want to come to your actual job because what is your role in all of this as resident coordinator in Kenya?
Well, those listening to us on the podcast won't be able to see the beautiful SDGs behind you, the Sustainable Development Goals, but there they are, all 17 of them displayed with their icons on elimination of poverty, elimination of hunger, effective education and health, and going all the way through to climate change, biodiversity. Those 17 Sustainable Development Goals are my job. That's my job to bring the energies and the expertise of the whole United Nations system, that alphabet soup that runs from FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, all the way to WHO, the World Health Organization, and through all of the different UNs, UN Development Programme, UNICEF, and many, many others. We have 25 or so of those UN agencies, funds and programs in our UN Kenya country team. It's my job to bring them together to make sure that the support that we offer to Kenya's government and Kenya's people is greater than the sum of its parts. And then it actually goes a bit beyond that, because the first step is us coming together, but then actually even together, we're not big enough really to move the needle or to help Kenya move the development needle. You have to use your expertise, but also your weight to influence the flows of much bigger forms of development, the kinds of development financing that is delivered by the World Bank, the IMF, the big vertical funds, but particularly the private sector. So what we're trying to do is to really crowd in that kind of engagement for the SDGs, for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's, I suppose, my job to coordinate that.
I wonder what is keeping you awake at night when you think about Kenya and your role there and this daunting task?
Well, it's almost like we set this up, isn't it, Melissa? My what keeps me awake at night is the thought of failing that. And I don't mean individual failure, although of course I do also mean that. I don't want to fail. I want to feel that I've contributed, that I've helped. But much bigger than what I want is, it's going back to the start of our conversation. Kenya is this quite extraordinary place. I knew it first in 1986 as a student when I came here on a visit. And then I knew it again in 1992 when I first started my career as a young intern in the office of a big international NGO here in Nairobi. And if I measure where Kenya has come from and where it's got to, more or less precisely 3 decades later, 31 years later, that journey has been extraordinary. The country is bigger, more powerful in the positive sense of that word, more influential on the continent and in the world. Its voice is being heard at the global level. I think Kenya will continue on that trajectory. There'll be bumps and ups and downs as there are anywhere in the world, but I have no doubt that Kenya is on an upward curve. I want the UN to contribute to that. I'm sure we all in the UN want that. And it keeps me awake at night that we might fail at that. I don't think that means, by the way, that Kenya will fail, because I'm not sure that we're the key ingredient. But I would hate it if we didn't maximize every opportunity that we have to help advance that story. Kenya deserves it, and I think middle powers like Kenya really are needed to help shape the global trajectory. I'm being too philosophical. Let me make that as concrete as I can. The climate emergency. Where are the solutions going to come from? If you look at the African continent, you'll see a continent with the greatest natural endowment of renewable energy resources anywhere in the world, whether you're thinking solar, hydro, wind, geothermal, wave, you name it.
Let's come back to something that you mentioned at the beginning, was that you also have a love story that originated in Kenya. So you met your wife there. What was the circumstance? How did you meet? How old were you? What were you doing?
I was young then. We met when I was 27 and Laura was 25. I'm Irish. Laura's American from Idaho, so two eyes. Two places that grow potatoes, but that wasn't what brought us together. We were both interns working for an international NGO here. And we met actually in 1994. Earlier in this conversation, Melissa, you and I were talking a lot about the genocide in Rwanda, and I was working. I was in Rwanda, but coming backwards and forwards to both Bujumbura in Burundi, where we were having our sort of supply base for the emergency operations we were running, and then to Nairobi, which was then and is still very much the regional humanitarian hub for this part of the world. And Laura had actually taken over my job. I'd been there the year before her. We'd never met, but a whole bunch of people were conspiring to put us together already, having met each of us independently. My brother actually met her because he was working here too, met Laura and sent me a message saying, "I've met the woman that you're going to marry." Yeah, isn't that spectacular?
Really?
Yeah.
That is
incredible.
And if you know, your brother must know you really well.
Well, yeah, he had it worked out from very early on, as did colleagues in the NGO that had known us both, and so much so there was so much.
What was your first meeting like? Can you describe the encounter?
Oh, I can, because it's how long have you got? It's a lovely story. So everybody had been conspiring to put us together, and finally I flew in for one of these planning missions in the context of the Rwandan emergency response, and it was May the 12th, 1994. And the reason I know that is that it was the day before her birthday, and both of us had been built up for this, and I think both of us were a bit prepared to be disappointed. And I remember going into the office and meeting her and going, "Wow, I am very definitely not disappointed." And we had so many things in common already, a deep love for classical music. Laura's a terrific pianist, and I suppose I'm not a bad classical singer. We're both vegetarians, lifelong. We both have this deep love for Africa. Laura was here in Kenya as a student. So many things sort of pushing us together. And then, so we went out for lunch, and then we went out for dinner. And then the following day, I was due to fly to Bujumbura in Burundi, and then go back into Rwanda from there, right into the middle of the genocide and the war. And the driver, Ferdinand was his name. If Ferdinand is listening out there, make contact. I haven't seen him in 30 years. Ferdinand knew all about this and was part of the conspiracy to get us together. And so is saying, "So, how did it go?" And I said, "Actually, pretty good. Really, I'm pretty interested. I don't know about her." And he said, "Well, great. So how did you leave things?" And I said, "Well, obviously I'm heading off to this, and I don't know when I'll be back. But I said I'll be back, and I feel a little bit badly because here I am on the way. It's early morning. I'm on my way to the airport, and this is actually her birthday." Melissa, I'm not making this up. Ferdinand put his foot on the brakes hard and pulled over to the side of the highway and said, "You're not leaving. You can't leave on her birthday." And I said, "Don't be ridiculous. I've got a flight to catch. There's an emergency in Rwanda." No. You're not leaving. I said, "Come on, we've got to go." And he said, "Well, you've got to send her a present." And I said, "Well, look, if I give you some money, can you take some flowers?" Anybody who knows Nairobi knows that Nairobi is famous for its beautiful flowers sold by the side of the road, right? So Ferdinand says, yeah, look, give me what you've got, and I'll go and get some flowers and I'll deliver them. And so I took out, I think, 1,000 shillings, which these days is about $10. I think back then it would have been about 20. And I gave that to him. And I thought to myself, this is nice. This will actually buy quite a large quantity of flowers, and there'll be some left over for Ferdinand just to say thank you to him. He arrived later that morning into the offices of the NGO, to the reception desk, according to the receptionist, who I knew quite well as well, basically like a walking arboretum. I mean, you couldn't see him behind sort of about this many flowers. For the listeners at home, I'm holding my arms wide. I mean, he literally was carrying about, 10 kilos of cut flowers or something. He clearly not only spent all of my money that I'd given him, but added quite a bit of his own because he thought I was being a cheapskate. And from behind this sort of forest of flowers, says to Betty, the receptionist, "These are for Laura from her boyfriend, Jackson." So there was no going back from that, was there? And so
I really hope you get to see him again.
Yeah, the nice thing about it, just to sort of bring the story full circle, is that 25 years later, so we met in 94, we got married in 96, and in 2021 celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary in the same restaurant here in Nairobi where we had our first date.
An Indian restaurant, I believe.
That's right, Handi. Great restaurant. We'll put a free shout out to the Handi restaurant here in Westlands.
Handi. And you have 3 children, I believe?
3 children. Liam, who is 22, Finn, who is 20, both of them off and out in the world, university and graduating. And then Kira, our daughter, who is 16 and with us here at school in Nairobi and loving it.
A wonderful story.
And they were with us through all of this, through Gabon and DRC and Burundi, lived and grew up and educated there. So they spent most of their lives on the continent too.
I'm just wondering what sparked your interest in kind of serving the United Nations or international affairs, and how did you end up in Kenya? Was this an influence from your family?
It was, but funnily enough, it was an influence against which I struggled for quite a while. So my parents, my mum and dad, met working for Oxfam in the 1960s. And they lived and worked in Togo, in West Africa, at the end of the 1960s when I was tiny. I was 1.5. So we were there for 2 years, left when I was 3.5, which meant that I don't really have any concrete memories of it. But it was knowing that I had been there was always part of the backdrop. And my father, my mother went back to a teaching career, but my father moved us back to Ireland, where he was headhunted to run the Irish government's volunteer sending agency, an agency called APSO. And he did that for 15 years of his career. My great love, I was always aware of that. I was always very supportive of that. We always had people from far-flung corners of the world coming and staying with us in the house in Dublin, from the African continent, but from Asia and Latin America too, and was very immersed with that and very politically active. But actually my great love as a teenager was maths and computers and physics. And that was my undergraduate degree. And I was absolutely firmly convinced that I was going off into a research career in artificial intelligence or in theoretical physics, one or the other. And then had this conversion experience. I think I mentioned earlier that I was here in Kenya, as well as in Tanzania, which I didn't mention, in 1986. That was the summer of my second year, going into my third year of my undergraduate maths degree. And the Irish government organised a debating competition on development themes, the Department of Foreign Affairs, university-wide in Ireland. I got pulled into the team as a kind of a ringer. I was a debater at college, which probably doesn't come as a surprise. And we won the competition, and the prize was a study trip to East Africa. And I came here and went, oh, this is why my dad and mum did this. This is fascinating. This is what I want to do. And it was actually more than Tanzania was great, but it was Kenya, even then, that was the conversion experience. Because I was so struck by this combination of tradition and modernity already in 1986, and this country that was on an upward curve. And that was it. Fell in love. That's what I wanted to do.
You were working in the aftermath of one of the world's worst genocides in Rwanda. How has that kind of shaped you, seeing and witnessing the effects of war and atrocities and genocides?
Yes, it really has shaped my professional life, and it's also shaped my outlook on life. I don't take it for granted that any country in the world is beyond conflict. I don't take it that any country in the world is immune from the kinds of meltdown that happen to be afflicting right now, 25 countries or so in the world, but could just as easily happen again in parts of the world that are at the moment at peace. And so then I think that does shape my philosophy about, first of all, what life is and the beauty but the fragility of life. You can't, as a young person, as I then was, see that kind of suffering and destruction without it leaving a very deep mark. It's very easy for me, and I won't do it now, but it's very easy for me to, start recollecting things that I saw, friends that I lost, reconstructing in my mind the vivid nature of that kind of suffering, and it reduces me to tears in a second, 30 years later. But it also then, I hope, informs the sort of the professional side of me. First of all, I hope it keeps me a bit modest. I may not have sounded very modest on this podcast, but that I don't hold myself above a Rwanda or a Kenya or a Somalia. I love Ireland very deeply. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that as a United Nations official, but anyway, I will. I love my home country very deeply. I'm very proud of it, but I don't necessarily think it's any better or any stronger or any more immune. I think we've had our share of good luck and ill luck in Ireland, and we are where we are. But it's really important to me, and I suppose that, to finally, by a circuitous route, finding my way to your real question, Melissa, that's why I work for the United Nations. Because every country and every person is actually fundamentally the same. We're all, of course, different in our different ways, but we are all the same. And we all face the same challenges. When death finally comes, as it does to all of us, that's when you learn, perhaps too late for some of us, the hard lesson that we're all the same. We start the same way, we end the same way. And that for me, that's a very deep conviction that I try to live up to. I'm not sure I do on a daily basis, but I try to retain that.
Thank you, Stephen, for joining me on this podcast.
It's really been a privilege. Thank you so much, Melissa.
Thank you for listening to Awake at Night. We'll be back soon with more incredible and inspiring stories from people working against huge challenges to make this world a better and safer place. To find out more about the series and the extraordinary people featured, do visit un.org/awake-at-night. Do subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and please take the time to review us. It helps more people find the show. Thanks to my editor, Bethany Bell, to Adam Paler, and to my colleagues at the UN, Caterina Catiti, Roberta Politi, Julia Hagel, Geneva Damayanti, Tulin Batiki, and Becerra Kostova, and the team at the UN studio. The original music for this podcast was written and performed by Nadine Shaw and produced by Ben Hillier. Additional music was by Pascal Wise.